Conscription. As global tensions rise, it's a topic that's resurfaced in the news across the world, and in Canada. Therefore, it is more important than ever that Canadians understand their nation's own history with policy, and particularly how the issue was faced during the Second World War. But to understand conscription and its importance in Canadian history, we must take a look at the First World War. During that conflict, the Canadian government struggled greatly to control how manpower was utilized in both civilian and military contexts, and ultimately, they fell under a system that assumed an infinite allocation for manpower over time. The results? At the end of May 1917, only 1,208 of the 6,407 volunteers for the Canadian Expeditionary Force willingly entered the infantry. To the Conservative government, led by Prime Minister Robert Borden, the only option to remedy the shortage of infantry was to introduce conscription. However, there was a major problem on the home front. French Canadians had become preoccupied with their own conflict within the country. Repeated legislative attacks against using the French language as an official language of instruction in Quebec had left many French Canadians angry. They questioned why they should have to fight for Canada, while their cultural and linguistic rights, guaranteed under the Confederation in 1867, were being trampled. The Military Service Act was passed on August 29, 1917. What followed was a series of revolts across Quebec as anti-conscription demonstrations regularly devolved into vandalism, riots, and even assassination plots. In the evening of April 1st in Quebec City, the situation reached its highest tension. English-speaking Canadian soldiers, unable to control a mob of demonstrators, opened fire into the crowd, killing 4 to 5 and severely injuring more than 70. Eventually, as the war wound down, the immediate tensions dissipated. But the Canadian conscription crisis of the First World War had left behind a significant wound within the heart of the nation. William Lyon Mackenzie King had witnessed the issue of conscription plague his mentor, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, even as he attempted to convince Laurier that siding with Borden on conscription was the only way to stop the Liberal Party from tearing itself apart. Laurier did not heed his advice, and the party did indeed suffer as a result. 20 years later, the country was on the verge of its next major conflict, with King now at the helm of the Liberal Party. King, who had become Prime Minister of the country in 1921, bore this failure of his predecessor heavily, and thus was an enthusiastic proponent of appeasement as a means to avoid Canadian involvement in another war in Europe. In fact, both major Canadian political parties at the time remembered the lessons of 1917 well, as both initially opposed any kind of conscription if war was to break out. When war finally did break out, with the beginning of the Second World War, there was no patriotic fervor in the streets, as there had been during the First World War, and most Canadians expected that policies like conscription would not be allowed to occur again. The British had, after all, only asked that Canada provide a token expeditionary force, along with technical personnel for support. However, the sudden end to the phony war of 1939 to 1940 and rapid fall of France saw King placed under a great deal of pressure to step aside and make way for a more warlike leader. In retaliation, King rapidly adopted the National Resources Mobilization Act, or NRMA, in June of 1940. The act sought to resolve the issues faced by the country during the First World War by more effectively managing resources across Canada, especially the resource of manpower. It introduced a very limited version of conscription that applied only to childless, non-married men between 21 and 24 for home defense exclusively. The response from Quebec was very muted. Anti-conscriptionists on all sides had been placated mainly due to the fact that conscripts could not be sent overseas. It would seem that King's limited mandatory service, as it existed in 1940, was a success. And yet, 4 years later, the country would end up on the verge of tearing itself apart, once again, over conscription. How did this happen? The answer lies in a mix of pride, nationalism, and militarism. A distinct political shift occurred in the English-speaking Canadian public as NRMA conscripts began to serve longer periods and became more visible to the public eye. Once in public, they became targets for criticism, as many saw the conscripts as not contributing fairly to the war, either in a military or industrial capacity. A sense of pride swooshed over English Canada as organizations like the Committee for Total War were formed to advocate that Canada participate to a greater extent in the conflict. They felt that the country ought to represent itself with a mightier hand on the world stage, and that the only way to do so was through policies like conscription. Mackenzie King once again maneuvered his way around pro-conscription political forces by calling for a nationwide plebiscite on April 27th. The plebiscite was specifically tailored to be vague, so that it would appease both pro- and anti-conscription forces. It only asked Canadians if they were okay with letting the government go back on their conscription promises. Despite fierce opposition from Quebec, Parliament passed a bill that gave the government the option to send conscripts overseas, which greatly angered French Canada. King ultimately dispelled the discontent by making clear that the policy would be not necessarily conscription, but conscription if necessary. The thing was, conscription was absolutely not necessary at that point in the war. By 1942, Canada had lost a total of about 5,000 Canadians, mostly at disastrous battles like Hong Kong and Dieppe, which was hardly breaching the nation's reserve of volunteers. But still, English Canadians clamored for conscription as a way to prove that Canada could act upon the world stage. By late 1944, conscription had become necessary. General Kenneth Stewart, Chief of Staff of the Canadian Military Headquarters in London, had been systematically camouflaging what he determined to be alarmist reports about serious Canadian manpower deficiencies. But the Battle of the Scheldt Estuary in October 1944 forced Stewart to come clean, as the casualties had been excessively high and threatened to take out all the reinforcements allotted to the Canadian Army in Northwest Europe. Many veterans of the Battle of the Scheldt recall how reinforcements scrounged up from rear supply units were being killed at an alarming rate, as most had not received proper training on weapons like the Bren light machine gun or even grenades. After an investigation into the matter by Defense Minister J.L. Ralston, it was determined that 16,000 soldiers were needed to maintain the overseas army, and that only the conscripts could fill this role adequately. There was actually around 200,000 volunteers, not in active combat positions, but they were all either hospitalized, on staff duties, or were in strategic garrisons. Only the conscripts of the NRMA were trained and available. How could such an oversight in manpower have occurred? Apart from Stewart's deception, there had also been widespread mismanagement of manpower within the Canadian Army. One post-war study of the Canadian manpower situation around the conscription crisis revealed that the Canadian Army had an excessively wide rear echelon. Of all the Canadian soldiers in Europe, only 22.4% were actually dedicated to fighting, with the rest serving in support positions. The problem was that in this sense of pride and nationalism that had taken over English-speaking Canada in 1942, a bit of it had reached the Army. The 1st Canadian Army was a proper field army that had 2 corps, each staffed with 2.5 divisions. For reference, American armies during the Second World War utilized 4.5 divisions per corps. The desire by top Canadian generals to have a fully independent Canadian field army with a proper 2 corps that could be on the stage ultimately meant the creation of an army that had been tremendously overstaffed as it tried to fill out too many headquarters. Ralston and King butted heads over the issue, as King felt the crisis of 1917 was beginning to repeat itself, while Ralston just wanted to get those 16,000 soldiers. Eventually, hoping to prevent overseas conscription, King dismissed Ralston and replaced him with the popular General Andrew McNaughton, who he charged with getting the 16,000 NRMA conscripts to volunteer willingly for service overseas. However, McNaughton ultimately failed in this task, as the conscripts of the NRMA remained firmly unconvinced. His back against the wall, dealing with discontent from all sides, McNaughton's admission that his efforts would be fruitless finally broke Mackenzie King's stance on conscription, as the Prime Minister authorized the conscripts to be sent overseas on November 22, 1944. And just like that, the conscription crisis of 1944 had come to a close. Ultimately, while there were some cases of disturbance in Quebec and other anti-conscription bastions, tensions again came down as it became clear that the war was ending. In the end, only 2,463 of the 16,000 conscripts actually made it overseas to the fighting, and at that point, the Canadian Army in Europe had seen the last of its major engagements. A total of only 69 NRMA conscripts were killed in Europe after being compelled into service overseas. As of 2025, it sometimes feels like Canada is more united than ever. But once again, the drumbeats of war can be heard in the distance. Time will tell what the future truly holds, but in the meantime, Canadians must keep in mind events like the conscription crisis of the Second World War. Conscription, today, may seem far-fetched, and Canada might seem united, but history reminds us just how quickly the tide of public opinion can turn into a crisis and lead us to uncover old wounds best left alone.